Welcome back to Razmafzar TV. I'm really proud and happy to have Professor Sharifi, Professor Majid Sharifi, here on our channel. Hi, Professor Sharifi. Welcome to Razmafzar TV.
Thank you so much, and thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. And Professor Sharifi, for our viewers, they would love, I'm sure, to know who you are. Could you just give us some background about information about your background, who you are, and where you teach and what you teach, please?
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much. My name is Majid Sharifi. I've been obviously, as any Iranian my age, we are children of politics. Politics affected us from the very, very early childhood.
Yes.
As I grew up in Iran in the 1960s and early 70s, before the revolution. So we are political being, whether we like it or not. And of course, politics forced us in some ways, forced people like me to be a part of the diasporic community. So I have lived in the United States for the last 50 years, a little bit over 50 years. So I'm very old. And I've gone through this horrible politics of course, we could say Orientalistic politics. And I'm going to explain to you what I mean by that. And of course, I was political. I have been, like I said, very political, even when I was in Iran in my teenage years. You could not get away from that. And then, of course, I came to the United States to just make a huge leap. I started doing scholarship, serious scholarship about 25 years ago or so, 30 years ago. I was always a part of the political dialogue and cultural dialogue. I was the director for a while, or a very active participant of an Iranian cultural society in South Florida. And we were, in fact, inviting many poets, novelists, filmmakers, and things that were related to Iranian culture. But then from there, I took on the serious understanding of politics. And I've been at it for the last 20, 25 years or so. My major scholarship is based on two things. One is the very idea of nationalism. And of course, the tragedy of nationalism in third world countries like Iran, and my specific, of course, attention to nationalism as it has emerged in the context of colonial structure of the world and what I call subaltern nationalism. That was the first book I wrote. And of course, it's problematic. That's one leg of it. We can talk about it later. And then the second case, because it's been nationalism in Iran, or subaltern nationalism in Iran and countries like Iran, has always been fragmented, discontented, conflicting, and problematic in a sense. And I looked into the question of why nationalism, in a sense, rather than bringing us peace and development, Iranian nationalism has brought us so much conflict. Whose fault is this? Then I came up with the idea of insecurity community, which is compared to security communities, security, regional security communities, as the example of US-led Western world. So I've been teaching those idea of culture, language, discourses, nationalism, and security issues in my university. I'm the director of international program at Eastern Washington University, and these are my focuses, as you would see. So I guess that's enough about me, and then we can go to another
Sure. So
question.
we prepared for you 16 questions, of course. And the first one was, as you said, introduction, and you introduced yourself. The second question, which is very important and we also agreed on that, is how does deterrence function and work as a strategy in international relations, especially in preventing armed conflict?
Thank you so much. We have to break this question into two parts. First, what is deterrence and where did it come from? If we really focus on that, deterrence is an imperialist, colonizing concept invented by great powers. By great, I don't mean positive. Great powers, colonizing powers, in order to deter each other and in their aim to divide the world and subjugate the rest of the world under their flags and for their interest. So deterrence was defined in the context of colonial powers and by colonial powers. So it's a colonizing theory to begin with. This, of course, the origin of it goes back to Machiavelli, an Italian scholar who wrote and who advised princes back in Italy of days in the 1500s, telling them that you need fear, in fact, coercion and fear, to rule and govern and relate to other countries or other mini-states at the time, rather than love. Love and respect and humanity has no place in that. Not that it's useless, but when you have to, it is the fear that rules. So that idea of fear as the basis for governance and relation to not only to other countries, but to the people that you rule, domestically and internationally, in a sense. In that sense, that's the basis of deterrence. The whole idea, the logic is the idea that you need to have so much power, coercive, violent, unhuman power to make sure that the other, your enemy, do not attack you, because you can exact revenge on them and make him pay for it. And of course, this is the basis for international relations at this point in time, a theory called realism, which is a theory of power. And this is one leg of it. And with deterrence, of course, comes another concept, which is balance of power. Again, since we are talking about power to coerce other people and other nations to conduct themselves based on fear. The idea is that you balance against each other, meaning that since power is the main instrument of rule and should be, not humanity, not norms, not values, not democracy, not type of regimes or anything like that. Power, and by power we mean coercive, violent power, power to kill, imprison, subjugate, deprive, and whatnot. And of course, from there, we have the idea of balance, because they say if you are a little bit weaker, you need to ally with other countries in order to create a balance between belligerents. So, in that case, in that perspective, there are never peace. We are always in a state of war, but war is when there is actually no hot war. Cold war is peace. So in other words, countries supposed to be, based on this theory, to be in war with each other forever. And ironically, they try to make this theory of imperialist colonizing theory as natural and innate to human communities across history. So it's ahistorical theory that emerged, obviously, from great colonizing powers, and it has become normalized into the way we think. But there is huge distinction here. Deterrence for great imperial colonizing powers does work. It actually works. But for weaker powers, even middle-sized power like Iran, deterrence is never enough. Is never enough because these countries do not have the power to, in fact, let's say, make United States or Britain or Germany to fear them for whatever reason. They have no power, they have no deterrence. So it becomes, again, it's connected to this idea that we can accept that fear works, but it has never worked for us. It has never worked for the third world countries. And that's intentional. That's intentional. Of course, we can't get out of this reality. This is the reality of the world order under democratic US regime that is institutionalized. And unfortunately, some people in academia buy into this theory as if this is natural, as if this is God-given, as if this is the only way to, in fact, conduct ourselves.
Professor Sharifi,
But that's not to reject that this doesn't work. It doesn't work for us.
based on what you mentioned, excuse me, I didn't want to interrupt you. I have two sub-questions regarding question number one.
Sure.
And I would like your input on that. I worked in different countries and different academic conferences, and okay, we did like historical arms and armor, as you know. So I went to Ukraine many times, like 7 times. I was invited by the University of Kiev and Ministry of Defense. And once one of our colleagues, a professor, Ukrainian professor, and I also worked in Russia twice for museums and all these arms and armor. And he told me something very interesting. Our Ukrainian colleague, I don't want to mention his name because I don't know if he wants to be mentioned, but he's a big person in Ukraine. One day he said, "Oh, Manusha, you studied not only in Germany, but in the US." I said, "Yeah, of course." And he said, "What is this? You were in Russia." I said, "Yeah, twice." "What is the similarity between Russia and US?" I said, "Yeah, there is something." And he said, "You know what is this?" "Yes, two empires." And he said, "There are two empires." And I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Look, Ukraine is a country. Iran is a country. These are not countries. These are empires." What you were talking about that, all of a sudden, it reminded me of our colleague, Ukrainian professor. Do you agree with these statements, this distinction between empires and countries, as our colleague made?
Yes. Countries, obviously, Iran, Ukraine, at this point in time, and many other countries are countries. Countries is generic name for a territory with a certain people, with a certain history, and rivers and mountains and geographical and topographical and also demographical characteristics. It's generic. Now, when we're talking about a country, each country at this point in time has a state. The state is again a little bit more specific in the sense that it doesn't include the rivers and this and that, but it includes the demography and the political system, the governing system. In Farsi or Arabic, we call it hukuma of the state. And then, of course, below that, we have below that is the nation. Nation and state are different. Since World War I, the idea of nation state, meaning that each political system of a given country, a given territory, is attached to a particular nation, particular in Arabic, millah, or in Farsi, millat, nation. And of course, within that, below that, you have the idea of regime, which is each country, each state, each nation state has a governing rule that rules it, like regime in Iran during Pahlavis. It had a certain norms that without even writing it, everyone knew what to say, or most people, what not to say. And people understood that. So that's kind of regime. And then, of course, we have government, the idea of the state, not state and nation and regime, but government. Government is the temporarily administrative ruling of a country. Like now we say the Trump administration, Trump government, Netanyahu government, but it's different from the Zionist regime in Israel. And of course, it's from the state is a little bit different, the concept and the country. So I explained this to answer your question in a long way, I'm sorry, is that yes, many of these entities are countries, could be state, they may be nation state, but their qualitative characteristics are differ from the imperial state. The imperial states can on their own, they are independent, they're sovereign, they can do things, they can change rules and laws. But little powers, small powers, or even mid-sized powers, they only go by the rule of the imperial order. Right now, the imperial order that we have, especially since World War II, is a US-led imperialist world order of nation states. But that doesn't mean all these nation states, even though theoretically they're sovereign, but that doesn't mean their sovereignty is as much as important, as qualitatively significant as the sovereignty of imperial states. Yes, it is. So your professor friend was correct. Ukraine is a country. Ukraine is a state. Ukraine can be a nation state. And Ukraine has a particular regime. And right now, a particular government run by Zelensky. But when you compare it to Russia, which is an empire and determines the level of sovereignty that Ukraine can have, that's a whole different subject.
Yes.
So, and the same thing with Iran.
Yes.
Iran was just attacked on June 13 for a 12-day war. Its sovereignty was violated. But the international law that the United States institutionalized since World War II, the sovereignty of of each country, every country, is sacred. It's international law. That's US-made law. It's a law that they made for themselves, US made for itself, and obviously it can violate it anytime. It violated in Afghanistan. It violated it in Iraq. It is violating it in Syria. It has violated many times in Iran. So we cannot, in fact, we cannot, at least people from the third world countries and colonized people, must not buy into this idea that we are sovereign under these colonial conditions. So colonial conditionality is so real. But sometimes in the scholarship community, in fact, we fall into the same trap, conceptual trap, that the imperialist conceptualization of world order, the naturalization of this world order has created for us. And I, in my scholarship, I question these colonizing concepts. Not that they're not real. Again, I'm emphasizing they are obviously real because there's power behind it, soft power and hard power. But that doesn't mean that's the only way it should be. And should we not recognize it? And a whole lot of time, many countries, people, nations, scholars, and parties, unfortunately, they take these concepts too seriously.
Yes.
Too seriously.
Professor
For example,
Sharifi.
the Iranian government writes and relies on the international institutions as if these international institutions are there to create equality among nations.
Yes, I agree. Professor Sharifi, one of my colleagues, now I teach intercultural management at the university here, and one of my colleagues who are also involved in this field once told me, excuse me, I'm laughing. I know he's going to listen to that, but it's okay. He said, Manosher, when do people in the third world countries, I said, you mean emerging markets, let's use it that way, or whatever, anyhow. And he said, yeah, when do they want to take responsibility? And I looked at him and I said, Matt, you're an academic. How can you even talk like that? You know, what? And he said, you are an academic. Haven't you heard about manufacturing consent? Haven't you heard about deterrence? Haven't you heard about subjugation? And you know, Professor Sharifi, what he said? He said, the days of colonialism are over. And you know, I looked at him and I said, you know what it reminds me of? And I said, what? I said, I work sometimes as a consultant as well. One of my clients who is, excuse me, I don't want to go by that, but belongs to the majority in the country I live. He has the looks of a majority here in Germany, everything, right? And he said, Manusher, I have never faced racism. And I looked at him. And how can you even face racism with your typical German name, typical looks? You understand? And I just told my friend, this is a similar statement. You come from this country, a country which is at least in the orbit of the United States. I call it that way if I'm right. Protected orbit, which is called Germany. And you say, when do people in those countries want to take up responsibility? As if people in those countries, those like Iran or others, cannot manage themselves. And this is something which is really condescending, which goes to what you were saying, but we come back to this Orientalistic attitude. But we will come back to it, Professor Sharifi. Excuse me,
No,
go ahead, please.
it's a great point, Manucher, that you are making. Truly great point. The fact that, and I just want to say this, when we say colonization has different dimensions. One dimension, obviously, is taking territory. Another dimension is taking over the political system, which we call it imperialism. You don't have to take over a country and govern it like Britain used to do over India in order to colonize it. You can actually control it remotely, in a sense, through institutionalizing your thought, your concept, your rules, your force, your economic structure, and whatnot. That's called imperialism. And imperialism is just the newer, deterritorialized version of territorial colonialism. But it's the same. Now we are in the era of deterritorialized colonialism, meaning that you control territories without really controlling it physically. These are really tangible things that we can measure. But there is another aspect of colonialization that is so very important. And that's the colonizations of cultures, mind, subjectivity of people, norms, the way people get to admire things and buy into them and take them very seriously, as I previously stated. Concepts ideas, ways, behaviors, way of clothing, way of talking, way of thinking, that they think this is the best way. And of course, that is the power of imperialism today, the
Professor
power
Sharifi,
of its software,
I'm
which
going
is
to take.
Orientalistic. And then I just let me just say this,
Mm,
because I want to go back to your question.
sure.
The idea that a lot of people from many of these smaller countries, colonized countries, they are so colonized in their own mind, they admire actually some of the things that is kind of capturing their imagination. So that's where we are. That's Orientalism. When the Oriental thinks like the Orientalizers, if I may say so. I know it gets concepts confusing like that. But when Jalal Ahmad said Westoxication or Westoxification or Western struckness, or the idea that Iranians are so mesmerized, so hypnotized, so seduced, so attracted to the Western ideas that they have lost their own identity, meaning their own thinking. They are non-being, as Fanon would say, Franz Fanon. They are non-being. They no
Yes.
longer have an identity. And their concept is borrowed concept which doesn't fit them. Their theories are
Yes.
theories that doesn't fit the reality of their context. This is where we are.
Professor Sharifi, to underpin, because I'm mesmerized by your statements and what you said, and now you're explaining more. I can, unbelievable. I would like to give three examples, and I would like you to just evaluate for us. The first one, I worked as an editor for a special journal issue of a journal, is a peer review academic journal, which is dedicated to historical arms and armor, swords, armor of Iran through different periods. It was just published just recently in Iran, Ministry of Science, and I was responsible for that among others. I asked many colleagues from Russia, from Ukraine, from United States of America, United Kingdom, other countries, Germany, France, many, many people, and Iranian scholars. They all wrote articles in that. And one of the major editors there, he was not the only one, but I just mentioned his statements. After they were published, in this field, lots of good things come from Ukraine, Russia. I don't know. There's so many sword classifiers, analysts who come from those countries. You know what our Iranian colleague said? Our Iranian colleague said, wow, unbelievable. Anything written by the US participants you brought in, you asked them to participate, and Western Europeans, Professor Sharifi, please mark that, not Eastern, Western, you hear me, but especially the US scholars are top notch. You can tell that they have brought law and order to this world. I looked at him. I said, what? He just said, our Russian colleague wrote such an interesting article. Our Ukrainian colleague as well. Our Iranian colleagues as well. How can you even say that? And said, do you realize they're controlling your mind? And Professor Sharifi, we are talking about an established professor and researcher who said that. I will never forget this day, Professor Sharifi, because believe me, I was an editor as well. It was not a question of East and West. It was a question of, it was, all of them were good. And then some people from Russia were better, some people from this and that. And I just said, what is going on in his brain? Okay, he has never lived abroad, right? He always lived in Iran. That he thinks everyone coming from US, followed by Western Europe, are top notch. As if he has a cultural lens, he doesn't see anything written by Asians and Russians and Ukrainians and unbelievable. And Professor Sharifi, I have seen this cultural lens, if I may call it cultural lens, I can even say a filter among many people in Asia. What is this, Professor Sharifi?
Well, I think you answered your own question. It is the the idea of power and subjugation, colonization of the mind and people's subjectivity, and the conditions of coloniality, meaning, in a sense, that the colonial conceptual structures have been so dominated that it has really mesmerized us. And that's why I invoked the idea of God bless his soul and Jalal Ahmad when he talked about Westoxification, or Gharb Zadegi in Farsi. And of course, when he wrote it in the 1960s, he wasn't a scholar. He was a novelist, obviously, and very respectable guy, but a novelist, not an academic, not a political scientist or sociologist, a novice one as maybe ethnographer. But anyway, what he said is what Edward Said said in 1970s, and what Frantz Fanon in some other ways said in 1950s and 60s. And I don't want to mention names, but hundreds of others have pointed out to this fact of um, uh, how power is knowledge and how power can create a knowledge. Power and knowledge are not two packages from each other. In American lingo, the hard power and soft power are compact together. They constitute each other. They reproduce each other. They are two sides of the same coin. So when we talk, for example, of the American-led democracy, American-led law and order, this is the soft power. This is one side of it. But integral to this side, integral to this law, integral to this order, is the coercive power of imperialism, and US-led imperialism in this case. And in that sense, a whole lot of people fall into this trap, and you can't blame them. This is, human beings are malleable. They